The air in the redemption bank was thick with the scent of stale paper and desperation. It clung to Jed Collins like the fine red dust on his boots. He stood before the banker's desk hat in his hands, shoulders set in a line as unyielding as the horizon outside. The banker, a man named Henderson, whose soft belly spoke of a life free from hardship, peered over his spectacles. "The drought's been hard on everyone," Jed Henderson said, his voice a smooth, polished stone. "The bank can't extend any more credit. Not on a ranch that's turning to dust. The rains will come." Jed stated, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't a plea. It was a prayer ground down to its last stubborn syllable. "I just need enough to hold on, to buy feed, to fix the well pump. Hope doesn't pay mortgages, my boy." Jed's jaw tightened. He felt the familiar bitter sting of failure. His father, Judge Collins, had built this ranch from nothing, his legacy carved into every fence post and fieldstone. His brother Michael had dreamed of expanding it, of filling the pastures with prize-winning stock. Now it was all blowing away on the wind, and Jed was helpless to stop it. He reached into his vest, his calloused fingers closing around the cool, smooth silver of the locket. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He knew the two tiny portraits within by heart, Michael and his sweet wife Eleanor, and their faces frozen in a moment of bright, unending promise. A promise that had ended in a flash flood 2 years prior. The locket was all he had left of them. It was his anchor in a sea of loss. "There must be something," Jed began, his voice cracking with a frustration he rarely allowed himself to show. He never finished the sentence. The bank's front door slammed open, crashing against the wall with the force of a gunshot. 3 men burst in their faces, obscured by grimy bandanas. The chaos erupted instantly. Henderson yelped, diving behind his desk. A clerk screamed. The 2 other customers in the bank threw themselves to the floor. The men moved with brutal efficiency, their pistols glinting in the shafts of dusty sunlight. On the floor, now one of them barked, his voice raw and gravelly. Jed didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the leader, a tall man who stood apart from the others, his posture calm, almost languid. He wore a long black duster, and his eyes, visible above the bandana, were a pale, chilling blue. They held no panic, only a cold, predatory intelligence. Jed's hand instinctively went to the worn holster at his hip, but a sharp jab from a rifle butt sent him staggering back against the teller's cage. Pain exploded in his ribs. "Don't be a hero, rancher," the man with the rifle sneered. The leader walked slowly toward Jed, his boots making no sound on the wooden floor. His gaze swept over Jed's worn clothes, his sun-beaten face, and then stopped fixated on the silver chain, barely visible at Jed's collar. "Well, well," the leader's voice was a surprise, not a rough bark, but a low-cultured murmur that was somehow more menacing. "What have we here?" Before Jed could react, the man's gloved fingers darted out, snatching the chain and ripping it from his neck. The locket swung in the air between them. Jed lunged forward, a raw cry torn from his throat. No. The reaction was immediate and savage. The man with the rifle slammed his weapon into Jed's stomach, doubling him over. Another kick sent him crashing to his knees. A boot connected with his jaw, and the world dissolved into a kaleidoscope of bright, searing pain. He lay on the floor, the taste of blood and dust in his mouth, his vision swimming. Through the haze, he saw the leader hold the locket up to the light. The man's thumb flicked it open. For a long, silent moment, he stared at the tiny portraits inside. Jed tried to push himself up, but his body wouldn't obey. "A sentimental man," the leader mused, his voice dripping with a strange, mocking intimacy. How touching. He snapped the locket shut and slipped it into his own pocket. He gave a slight nod to his men who had finished stuffing bags with cash from the vault. As they backed toward the door, the leader paused and looked down at Jed. He nudged Jed's ribs with the toe of his boot, a gesture of casual contempt. Some legacies, he said, his voice soft enough that only Jed could hear it, are meant to be buried in the dust. Then he was gone. The bank was left in a ringing silence, broken only by the whimpering of the clerk. Jed pushed himself into a sitting position, his body screaming in protest. He ignored the pain in his ribs and the throbbing in his head. All he could feel was the hollow, aching void where the locket used to be. They had taken more than money. They had stolen his last connection to the past, leaving him utterly, finally alone. The hope he had walked in with was gone, replaced by a cold, hard knot of rage and a name he would never forget, whispered to him by the town sheriff moments later, Silas Blackwood. The sun bled across the horizon, casting the plains in a bruised purple light, and the red sand glowed like embers under the last rays of day. Jed's ranch was a study in solitude. The cabin, built of sturdy pine by his father's hands, stood against the vast, empty landscape like a solitary gravestone. The corrals were mostly empty, the fields fallow and cracked. For 2 weeks since the robbery, Jed had moved through his days like a ghost, the ache in his ribs a dull echo of the sharper pain in his soul. The bank had, of course, refused his loan. Redemption was a town that kicked a man when he was down. He sat on the porch steps, cleaning a rifle with methodical, practiced movements, his mind 1,000 miles away. He was haunted by Blackwood's words. Some legacies are meant to be buried in the dust. It felt like a curse, a prophecy he was living out day by day. His legacy was failure. His inheritance was grief. The rhythmic clatter of a wagon approaching broke the evening stillness. Jed's hand tightened on the rifle. Strangers were rarely a welcome sight. As the wagon drew nearer, he recognized Otis Caldwell at the reins, flanked by 2 other ranchers, Samuel Boone and Clementine Shaw's husband, both of whom had offered him condescending pity more times than he could count. They were the ones who had sent the letter. A month ago, it had arrived, a proposal penned in Clementine's looping, self-important script. "A lonely man like yourself needs a wife." It had read, "A partner to share the burden. We have made arrangements for a suitable woman to travel to you, all expenses paid." Jed had nearly burned it. His pride, the last thing he had left, had recoiled from their charity. But the loneliness, a presence as real and oppressive as the drought, had worn him down. He'd sent a terse reply of acceptance, a single word that felt like a surrender. Otis pulled the wagon to a halt, a wide, smug grin plastered on his face. "Delivery for you, Jed, your bride, just as we arranged. Miss Fay Carille." Jed rose slowly, his eyes scanning the woman seated on the wagon bench. The last of the sunlight caught in her hair, turning it to spun gold. Her features were fine, sculpted with a delicacy that seemed out of place in this harsh land. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the horizon. It was only when she turned her head toward the sound of Otis's voice that Jed saw it. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, were beautiful, and they were completely vacant of sight. She was blind. A cruel, heavy silence descended. Jed could feel the men's anticipation, their glee hanging in the air. This was their punchline. The proud Jed Collins, too good for any of the local girls, saddled with a blind wife. A broken man for a broken woman. He was supposed to rage, to curse them, to send her back. "Of course," Otis drawled, savoring the moment, "we might have forgotten to mention one tiny detail in our letter." Jed ignored them. His gaze was locked on the woman. He saw the proud set of her jaw, the straightness of her spine. He saw the faint trembling in her hands, a sign of a will fighting to hold itself together in the face of profound humiliation. She was not a punchline. She was a person trapped in their casual cruelty. "Miss Carilli," he said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through their snickering. She turned her head precisely toward the sound of his voice. "Mr. Collins," she replied, her own voice steady and clear, a thread of steel woven through its soft melody. In that moment, Jed saw not her blindness, but a reflection of his own embattled existence. She was a survivor, just like him. She was holding on, just like him. The world had tried to break her, and she had refused to shatter. He stepped off the porch, his boots crunching in the dry dirt. He walked past Otis's triumphant sneer and Samuel's nervous fidgeting, stopping directly beside the wagon. "Aren't you going to ask what kind of sick joke this is?" Otis prodded. "We sent you damaged goods, Jed." "I can hear you." Faye said, her voice sharp with an indignation she could no longer contain. "I am not an object to be discussed. If this arrangement is not to your liking, Mr. Collins, these men can take me back. I will not stay where I am not wanted." Her dignity was a shield bright and impenetrable. Jed looked up at her, at this stranger, sent to mock him, and felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt since the bank robbery connection. He extended a hand. "Miss Carilli," he said, his voice softer now. "Would you allow me to help you down?" Her head tilted, a silent question. Her fingers, tentative at first, found his. Her hand was small in his calloused palm, but her grip was firm. As he helped her to the ground, he turned his gaze on Otis, his eyes as cold and gray as storm clouds. "The lesson seems to be for you, Otis." Jed said, his voice flat and dangerous. "You've had your fun. Now get off my land." Otis's face flushed. "You can't be serious, Jed. She can't cook, she can't clean." "That's enough," Jed interrupted. He stood protectively beside Faye, a silent, immovable wall. The men, seeing the cold fire in his eyes, scrambled back onto their wagon. As they rode away, their confused, angry shouts were swallowed by the vast emptiness of the plains. The silence they left behind was different. It was not empty, but filled with a fragile, unspoken understanding. Jed still held Faye's hand. He could feel the fine bones beneath her skin, the slight tremor that had not yet subsided. He had accepted a stranger into his broken life, a woman sent as an insult. He didn't know if it was the most foolish or the wisest decision he had ever made. But as he looked at Faye Carilli standing tall in the fading light, he knew one thing for certain. He was no longer entirely alone. The silence that followed the wagon's departure hung between them like morning mist. Faye stood beside Jed, her hand still resting lightly in his, her face turned toward the sounds of the ranch. She could hear the lowing of the few cattle he had left, the creak of the windmill, turning in the evening breeze, the soft rustle of dry prairie grass. "It's peaceful here," she said quietly, and Jed was surprised by the genuine appreciation in her voice. "Most folks find it too quiet," he replied, finally letting go of her hand. He felt self-conscious, acutely aware of the dust on his clothes, the roughness of his unshaven jaw. "I've lived with noise my whole life." Faye said, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. "People talking at me, arguing over what to do with me, deciding my future without ever asking what I wanted. This is the first time in years I've heard nothing but the world breathing." The simple poetry of her words struck a chord deep inside him. "What did you want, Miss Carilli?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. She turned toward him, and for a moment her composure slipped. The mask of serene dignity fell away, revealing a flicker of raw vulnerability. "I wanted to matter," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "To be more than a burden. To be useful." The honesty of her words hit him hard. He cleared his throat. "Well, you'll matter here. There's more work than one man can handle." Then show me, she said immediately, her voice regaining its strength. Show me what needs to be done. Jed hesitated. Maybe you should rest first. Get settled in. Mr. Collins, Faye interrupted, and the steel was back in her tone. Those men expect me to fail. They expect you to regret this within a week. I will not give them the satisfaction. He saw it then beneath the delicate beauty, beneath the vulnerability of her blindness, a core of unbending iron. She had been fighting battles her entire life. He nodded slowly. All right. The cabin first. He led her toward the porch, his words painting a picture of the space for her. 3 steps up. Porch is 10 feet wide. The door is on your left. Her free hand trailed along the rough wooden railing, her fingers memorizing its texture, its height, its splinters. Inside the cabin smelled of old leather stale coffee and the faint, lingering scent of wood smoke. Jed watched as she stood in the doorway, her head tilted, a cartographer of sound and scent. She catalogued the drip of the water pump, the hum of the wind through a crack in the window pane, the location of the hearth by its residual warmth. There are 3 rooms, he explained, his voice feeling loud and clumsy in the small space. Kitchen to your left. Main room here. The bedroom is through that door. It's yours. I'll sleep in the barn. I will not put you out of your own bed, Mr. Collins. It's Jed, he said gruffly, and it's not a request. She gave a small, conceding nod. She took a few careful steps into the kitchen area, her hands outstretched, mapping the world by touch. Her fingers found the edge of the table, the cool iron of the water pump, the cold surface of the wood-burning stove. She moved with a grace that was both cautious and confident, a dance of memory and perception. When did you last have a proper meal? She asked suddenly. The question caught him off guard. I manage. That isn't what I asked. She continued her exploration, her hands brushing over a stack of dusty plates, a half-empty sack of flour. She was creating a map of his life, a life of solitude and neglect. Then her fingers brushed against something on the small mantel over the stove. Paper, delicate and worn thin from handling. His reaction was sharp, involuntary. Don't touch that. It was too late. Her sensitive fingertips had already registered the texture, the careful fold lines of a letter read many times. She pulled her hand back, as if burned her cheeks flushing. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. It's nothing, Jed said quickly, his voice harsh as he crossed the room and snatched the letter, shoving it deep into his pocket. Just old papers. The letter was from his sister-in-law, Eleanor's sister, written a year ago. It was a final, desperate plea for him to sell the ranch and come east to leave the ghosts behind. A life raft he had refused to take, choosing to drown slowly in his grief instead. Faye turned toward his voice, her brow furrowed with concern. Jed, if there's someone else, if this arrangement is a mistake, I can leave. I won't be the cause of more trouble. There's no one else. He said the roughness in his tone meant more for himself than for her. The silence stretched between them, thick with his secrets and her unspoken questions. To break the tension, she turned back to the kitchen. I'll start on dinner. You don't have to. Yes, she said, her voice firm. I do. I came here to work. Let me. He watched fascinated as she began to assemble a meal from his meager supplies. Her movements were economical and precise. She located a mixing bowl by sound, tested the freshness of the flour by smell, and began kneading biscuit dough with the practiced skill of someone who saw with her hands. A quiet competence radiated from her, transforming the neglected kitchen into a place of purpose. As the comforting smell of baking bread began to fill the cabin, chasing away some of the lingering shadows, Jed felt a knot in his chest begin to loosen. He had let a stranger into his home, but for the first time, in a very long time, the silence didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like waiting. The town of Redemption festered with gossip. The story of Jed Collins and his blind bride became the main currency of conversation at the general store and the saloon. Otis Caldwell, nursing a bruised ego, embellished the tale, with each telling painting Jed as a fool and Faye as a helpless burden. "Give him a month," Otis declared to a rapt audience at the saloon. "He'll be begging us to take her back. A man can't run a ranch and wet nurse a blind woman at the same time." But a month passed, and then two. The wagon from the Collins ranch was seen in town only for essential supplies. Jed was quieter than ever, his face a grim, unreadable mask. Faye, when she accompanied him, sat straight-backed on the wagon's seat, her face serene, never speaking, never giving the gawking townsfolk the satisfaction of seeing her falter. They became an enigma, their shared isolation a fortress the town's scorn could not penetrate. Back at the ranch, a quiet rhythm had established itself. Faye rose before dawn, the sound of her movements a soft counterpoint to the chirping of crickets. By the time Jed came in from the barn, the cabin would be warm, the scent of coffee and fresh biscuits in the air. She had learned the layout of the cabin and the yard with astonishing speed. She could navigate her way to the chicken coop to gather eggs, tend the small vegetable garden she had insisted on planting, and mend Jed's worn clothes with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She was not a burden. She was an anchor. Her presence brought an order to his chaotic life that he hadn't realized was missing. They spoke little, but their silences were comfortable, filled with the shared sounds of work. He found himself watching her, marveling at the way she'd tilt her head to identify a bird by its song, or run her fingers over a tomato vine to know if the fruit was ripe. She was more attuned to the world than anyone he had ever known. One afternoon, as a storm gathered on the horizon, Jed found her on the porch, her face turned toward the wind, a small, peaceful smile on her lips. "Smells like rain," she said. "It might pass us by," he replied, his voice laced with the ingrained pessimism of a drought-weary rancher. "Usually does." "No," she said with quiet certainty. "This one will stay. The air tastes different, heavier." He sat on the step below her, the scent of ozone sharp in the air. He found himself wanting to fill the silence, to know more about the woman who had so seamlessly woven herself into the fabric of his life. Faye. He began the name, still feeling unfamiliar on his tongue. "Why did you agree to this? To come all this way to marry a stranger you'd never met?" She was quiet for a long moment, listening to the rising wind. "Because I was running out of choices," she said finally, her voice low. "People see my eyes, and they see a list of things I cannot do. They stop seeing the person. I thought, maybe a man who needed help wouldn't care how that help was given." She paused. "And I had a promise to keep." A promise. Before she could answer, the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, spattering against the dusty ground. But the promise of the storm was overshadowed by the sight of a lone rider approaching, moving at a steady, deliberate pace. It was not a neighbor. The man rode a fine black stallion and wore a tailored coat that spoke of wealth and authority. As he drew closer, a cold dread coiled in Jed's stomach. He recognized the man's chilling blue eyes and arrogant posture. It was Silas Blackwood. Blackwood reined in his horse a few yards from the porch, his gaze sweeping over the modest ranch with an air of dismissive appraisal. He dismounted with fluid grace, his polished boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. "Collins," he said, his voice as smooth and cold as Riverstone. He tipped his hat slightly toward Faye. "Ma'am." His eyes lingered on her for a moment too long, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. "What do you want, Blackwood?" Jed asked, rising to his feet, placing himself between Blackwood and Fay. "Business merely," Blackwood said with a thin smile. "I've been acquiring some of the neighboring properties. The Miller place, the old Johnson homestead. Thought I'd extend you the courtesy of an offer before I approach the bank directly about your outstanding debts." The threat was veiled but unmistakable. Blackwood was circling him like a vulture. "The ranch isn't for sale," Jed said, his voice hard. "Everything is for sale, Collins. It's simply a matter of finding the right price." Blackwood's gaze drifted past Jed toward the land, a proprietary gleam in his eye. "This is good land. Or it was. A shame to see it go to waste. It takes a certain kind of man to make a place like this thrive. A man with vision, not one clinging to sentimental memories." The words were a deliberate echo of their encounter in the bank. This wasn't just about land. This was personal. "Get off my property," Jed growled. Blackwood chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "As you wish. For now." He turned to leave, then paused, his eyes landing on a small, hand-carved bird sitting on the porch rail, something Jed had whittled in a rare moment of peace. "A man should be careful what he holds dear," Blackwood said softly. "It's so easy to lose things." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving behind a silence more menacing than the approaching storm. The rain began to fall in earnest, a steady drumming rhythm on the cabin roof. But the relief Jed should have felt was replaced by a cold certainty. The drought of the land might be ending, but a different, more dangerous storm was just beginning. The weeks that followed Blackwood's visit were marked by a slow tightening pressure. The rain that had promised relief was sporadic, not enough to break the drought, but just enough to turn the dust to mud. Jed learned that Blackwood had bought the land upstream, diverting the small creek that fed his well. The water level dropped daily. The squeeze was on. To save money, Jed took on day work at other ranches, mending fences and breaking horses, leaving Fay alone for long stretches. The work was grueling, the pay minimal, and the time away from his own failing ranch felt like a betrayal. One evening, he returned late, bone-weary and discouraged, to find the cabin filled with a warm, savory light. Fay had a fire roaring in the hearth and a stew simmering on the stove. She had also been busy. On his father's old desk in the corner, which had been buried under years of dust and neglected ledgers, now sat organized stacks of papers. "What's all this?" he asked, gesturing toward the desk. "I was looking for a spare blanket in the chest at the foot of your father's bed," she explained, her voice hesitant. "I found a box of his old legal papers. I thought, perhaps there might be something useful. A record of water rights, an old deed." Jed grunted, running a hand through his dusty hair. "My father was a judge, not a rancher. He kept meticulous records of every case he ever heard. It's mostly junk." "Perhaps," she said softly, "but I organized them, by year." He walked over to the desk, more to appease her than out of any real hope. He picked up a bundle of documents tied with faded ribbon. "Court transcripts, County of Redemption, 1855. He thumbed through the brittle pages, his father's precise, elegant script covering every line. He saw names he recognized, disputes over cattle and land that were still being argued by the sons of the original litigants. And then he saw a name that made him freeze. The People versus Thomas Blackwood. Charge arson and murder. Jed's blood ran cold. He sank into the chair, untying the ribbon with trembling fingers. He read through the transcript, the story unfolding in his father's dispassionate legal prose. Thomas Blackwood, a homesteader with a small plot of land bordering the Collins Ranch, had been accused of setting a fire that destroyed a neighbor's barn and killed the man inside. The evidence was circumstantial, a footprint, a witness who claimed to have seen Blackwood near the scene. Thomas Blackwood had sworn his innocence, claiming he was being framed by a powerful cattle baron who wanted his land. But the verdict was swift and absolute. Guilty. The sentence was death by hanging. A note was tucked into the back of the file, a small folded piece of paper. It wasn't part of the official record. It was a journal entry written in his father's hand, dated the night after the verdict. A terrible mistake has been made today. May God forgive me, for I cannot forgive myself. The truth lies buried, but I fear it will not stay buried forever. The sins of the father. The sentence was left unfinished. Jed, what is it? Faye asked, sensing the sudden chilling stillness in the room. Blackwood Jed whispered, his voice hoarse. Silas Blackwood. His father was Thomas Blackwood. My father sentenced him to hang. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The cryptic comments, the unnerving obsession with his family, the squeeze play on his land. This wasn't business. This was a vendetta 30 years in the making. Silas Blackwood wasn't trying to buy his ranch. He was trying to exorcise a ghost to reclaim a legacy he believed was stolen from him, and to punish the son for the sins of the father. The sound of hoofbeats outside shattered the revelation. Not one rider this time, but several. Jed looked out the window and his heart sank. It was the town sheriff flanked by 2 deputies, and they weren't here for a social call. The sheriff, a portly man named Gable, with whom Jed had always had a civil if distant relationship, pounded on the door. Jed Collins, open up. Jed opened the door, his mind still reeling. Sheriff, what's the trouble? Gable's eyes flicked past Jed to where Faye stood near the hearth, her face pale in the firelight. The trouble, Jed, is that I have a warrant here for the arrest of one Faye Carille. He held up the paper. She's wanted in Three Forks County for theft. Jed stared at him, dumbfounded. He looked back at Faye. Her serene composure had shattered. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. The promise she had mentioned, the secret she had been holding close, was about to be torn from her. The warrant claims she stole $53 from a church fund, Gable said, his voice devoid of sympathy. Money meant for medicine, for sick children. Jed's world, which had just been rocked by a ghost from the past, was now collapsing under the weight of the present. He looked at Faye, at the woman who had brought a quiet order to his life, who smelled of rain and baking bread, and saw a stranger, a thief, a liar. Faye, he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Is it true? She flinched as if he had struck her. Tears welled in her sightless eyes and began to trace paths down her cheeks. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Her silence was an answer more damning than any confession. And in that moment, Jed felt the fragile foundation of the life they had started to build together crumble into dust. The cabin felt small, suffocating. Sheriff Gable and his deputies stood in the doorway, their presence filling the space with the cold authority of the law. Jed's mind was a whirlwind of betrayal and confusion. Silas Blackwood wanted his land for revenge. Faye Carille was a wanted thief. Every pillar of his new reality had crumbled in the space of an hour. I can explain, Faye whispered, her voice trembling. Ma'am, you can explain it all to the judge in Three Forks, Gable said gruffly. Now are you going to come peacefully? Wait. Jed said, his voice a low command. He stepped in front of Faye, shielding her. Let her speak. He turned to her, his own voice hard laced with the pain of her deception. Explain. Faye took a shuddering breath, her hands twisting in the fabric of her apron. The money. It wasn't for me. It was for my sister Clara, or rather for her babies. Gable snorted. "We heard this story back in Three Forks. Your sister's been dead for 2 years. No," Faye insisted, her voice gaining a desperate strength. "She didn't die. She ran away. She was with Child and our father. He was a hard man. He would have thrown her out. She came back in secret to a small abandoned line shack a few miles from town. I was the only one she told." She paused, gathering her courage, her face pale and earnest in the flickering lamplight. "She gave birth there, alone, to twin girls. They were born too early, and a fever took hold of them. The doctor said they needed medicine, a specific kind, expensive. Clara had nothing. I had nothing." Jed watched her face, searching for a lie, for the cunning of a criminal. But all he saw was raw, remembered anguish. This wasn't a performance. It was a confession torn from the soul. The church had a fund, she continued, tears now streaming freely down her face. "For the poor, for the sick." I asked the Reverend, but he refused. He said Clara had brought shame on herself and had to live with the consequences. But the babies? They were innocent. They were dying. Her voice broke, so I took it. I didn't think of it as stealing. I thought of it as a loan. I left a note, my mother's silver locket, as collateral, promising to pay it back. I bought the medicine and ran back to the shack. A terrible silence filled the room. "And the babies?" Jed asked softly. Faye's composure finally broke. A sob escaped her. "The medicine came too late for Clara. She was too weak. She died that night. But the twins, they survived. I brought them back to town, and no one would believe me. They said I'd invented the story to cover my theft. They searched, but I had already hidden them. Hidden them where Gable demanded, his skepticism warring with the raw emotion of her story. With a good woman, a widow named Eleanor Hayes, who lived in the valley. She knew Clara. She believed me. She promised she would care for them until I could find a way to support them to make a proper home." Faye turned her sightless, pleading eyes in Jed's direction. "That's the promise I had to keep, Jed. That's why I agreed to come here. I needed a home. For them." Jed's heart, which had hardened into a knot of betrayal, began to ache with a different emotion. He saw it all now. Her desperation, her fierce protective love. She hadn't lied to him out of malice, but out of fear of a world that had already judged and condemned her. "A fine story, ma'am," Gable said, though his voice had lost some of its edge. "But Mrs. Hayes packed up and left the valley months ago. No one's heard from her." "I have," Faye said, her chin lifting with a spark of defiance. "I know where she is. I've been sending what little money I could earn to her. To a town called Haven, 2 days' ride from here." Jed made his decision. It wasn't a choice of the head, but of the gut. He believed her. He looked at Sheriff Gable, his expression unyielding. "She's my wife." He stated the words, solidifying a truth he hadn't even admitted to himself. "Her debt is my debt. I will pay back the $53. But you are not taking her." "Jed, I have a warrant." "And I have a rifle." Jed said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You are not taking her." He then looked at Faye, his gaze softening. "We'll ride to Haven. We'll get the girls." He had just discovered his family's dark past and his bride's secret. His ranch was being stolen from under him, and the law was at his door. But in that moment of absolute chaos, one thing became perfectly clear. His fight was no longer just for a piece of land or a faded memory. It was for her, and for the 2 children he had never met. It was a fight for a future. The journey to Haven was a silent one, fraught with tension. Jed and Faye rode in the wagon, the sheriff and his deputies trailing behind at a reluctant distance, a constant looming reminder of the stakes. Faye's story had bought them time, but not freedom. Proof was required. Haven was a small, dusty settlement nestled in a valley that seemed to have been overlooked by the rest of the world. Following Faye's directions, they found the small cabin of Eleanor Hayes. An older woman with kind, weary eyes opened the door, her face breaking into a relieved smile at the sight of Faye. "Faye, thank the Lord. I was so worried." And then from inside the cabin came the sound of children's laughter. Two small girls, no more than 2 years old, with identical mops of golden curls and eyes as blue as their mothers, toddled out onto the porch. They were the living, breathing proof of Faye's story. Sheriff Gable stared, his mouth agape. The deputies looked at each other, their suspicion melting into sheepish disbelief. The sight of the two healthy, happy girls shattered the last remnants of doubt. Eleanor Hayes produced the letters Faye had written, the small money orders she had sent, and the silver locket Faye had left as a promise. The case against Faye Carril dissolved into dust. Sheriff Gable, with a mumbled apology, tipped his hat and led his deputies away, leaving Jed and Faye on the porch with the woman and the 2 children, who had just turned their world upside down. The return trip was different. The silence was not of tension, but of awe and a fragile, burgeoning joy. The twins, Lily and Rose, sat between them on the wagon's seat, their small bodies radiating warmth. They were shy at first, but Faye's gentle voice and Jed's quiet, steady presence soon won them over. By the time their ranch came into view, Rose had fallen asleep with her head in Faye's lap, and Lily was chattering happily, pointing at a hawk circling in the sky above a sight Faye could hear but not see. Jed watched them, a feeling swelling in his chest, so powerful it almost hurt. He had spent years mourning a lost family. Now, impossibly, he was at the head of a new one. The sight of the 2 little girls, so full of life, against the backdrop of his failing ranch was a painful, beautiful contrast. It gave him something to fight for that was more real than land or legacy. But their newfound peace was short-lived. As they pulled up to the cabin, they found a notice nailed to the door. It was an official foreclosure warning from the Redemption Bank, citing his defaulted loan. And below the legal text, scrawled in an elegant mocking script, were 2 words: "Time's up." Blackwood. The threat was no longer veiled. He was done squeezing. He was ready to crush him. That evening, as the twins slept soundly in a makeshift bed near the fire, a new, more sinister threat arrived. A rider, not Blackwood himself, but one of his hired men, delivered a message. It was a deed to the Collins ranch already filled out, requiring only Jed's signature, and with it a letter from Blackwood. Collins, it read. "I know all about your new family. A charming story. A thief for a wife and 2 orphans. The good people of Redemption might be interested to learn that Mrs. Collins is not just a thief, but a fugitive who abandoned her post. A woman like that is hardly a fit mother. The state has ways of dealing with such matters. Orphans are placed in institutions, cold, gray places, unless, of course, a respectable citizen were to intervene. Sign the deed. Leave the land that was never rightfully yours. If you do, I will see to it that your family remains intact and unbothered. Refuse, and I will personally see to it that Faye is charged with child abandonment, and those pretty little girls are sent to an orphanage so far away you'll never see them again. The choice is yours." Jed read the letter, his blood turning to ice. Blackwood had found his true vulnerability. He wasn't threatening Jed's life or his land. He was threatening his family. He was offering him a terrible choice sacrifice, his honor, his birthright, the very ground his father was buried on, to save his family or fight and risk, losing them to the cold, impersonal machinery of the law. He looked at Faye, who was humming a soft lullaby to the sleeping girls. He looked at their innocent faces bathed in the warm glow of the fire. The legacy of his father, the weight of the past, seemed insignificant compared to the future sleeping in that room. Blackwood had him trapped. The sins of his father had finally come home to roost, and the price was not his own life, but the happiness of the people he had just learned to love. The sky turned a sickly yellow-gray. The wind, which had been a low moan all day, began to howl, picking up dust and grit, whipping it against the cabin in sharp, stinging waves. A sandstorm was coming, a furious, blinding squall that would swallow the world. It was a fitting backdrop for the storm raging inside Jed. He stood by the window, the deed in one hand, Blackwood's letter in the other. He could sign it. He could pack up the wagon, take Faye and the girls, and disappear. Start over somewhere new, somewhere the names Collins and Blackwood meant nothing. It would be the safe choice, the sensible choice. It would also be a surrender. He would be letting Blackwood win, letting him desecrate his family's legacy, all built on a lie. Jed Faye's voice cut through his turmoil. She had put the girls to bed and now stood beside him, her face etched with concern. "What did the letter say?" I heard the writer. His voice was cruel. He didn't answer immediately. He just handed her the letter. Her slender fingers traced the indentations of the ink on the page, a language only she could read. He watched as her face paled, as the meaning of the words settled upon her. Her hand flew to her mouth, a small horrified gasp escaping her lips. "He would use the children," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. "He would take them from us." "If I don't sign," Jed finished, his own voice flat and dead. She reached out her hand, finding his arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Then you cannot sign." Jed looked at her, astonished. "Faye, he'll do it. He has the power, the money. He'll paint you as an unfit mother, a criminal. They'll take Lily and Rose. And what kind of life would we give them if we teach them that the only way to live is to run from monsters?" she asked, her voice ringing with a conviction that shamed his own doubt. "What kind of home is built on a foundation of fear and surrender? This is our land now, Jed. Yours by birth and ours by the life we are trying to build on it. We cannot let him take it." Her strength was a fire warming the cold dread in his gut. She was right. To run would be to let Blackwood's poison taint the very thing they were trying to protect. "He's coming." Jed said, a new hard certainty in his voice. "He won't trust a letter. He'll come to collect the deed himself. He'll use the storm as cover." As if on cue, the wind shrieked, rattling the window frames. The world outside dissolved into a swirling vortex of brown sand. Visibility dropped to near zero. They were isolated, trapped. Jed moved with sudden purpose. He bolted the door, barred the windows. He checked his rifle, then the shotgun he kept over the hearth. He handed a small pistol to Faye. "Do you know how to use this?" She nodded, her face grim. "My father insisted I learn. He said the world had enough predators and I should not be easy prey." She handled the weapon with a steady, familiar competence. They waited. The storm was a deafening roar, a physical presence trying to tear the cabin apart. Inside, the silence was a taut wire. The firelight cast long, dancing shadows. Lily and Rose slept on, oblivious, their soft breaths a fragile counterpoint to the tempest outside. Then a sound. A splintering crash from the back of the cabin as the kitchen window was smashed in. They were here. Jed motioned for Faye to move toward the bedroom where the girls were sleeping. "Stay with them. Bar the door. Don't come out, no matter what you hear." "Jed, no, I can fight." "Your fight is keeping them safe. he said, his voice raw with urgency. He pressed a quick, hard kiss to her forehead. I love you, Faye. It was the first time he had said the words. She stared at him for a heart-stopping second, her sightless eyes seeming to see straight into his soul. I love you too, she whispered. Then she was gone, and the bedroom door clicking shut behind her. Jed took his position behind the overturned kitchen table, his rifle resting on the edge aimed at the back of the cabin. He heard muffled shouts, the crunch of boots. Two of Blackwood's men climbed through the broken window, pistols drawn. The world narrowed to the front sight of his rifle. He fired. The roar of the gun was deafening inside the small cabin. One of the men cried out and fell. The other returned fire bullets thudding into the thick wood of the table. Suddenly, the front door exploded inward, ripped from its hinges by the force of 3 men throwing their weight against it. Silas Blackwood stood framed in the doorway, the raging storm behind him, his long duster whipping in the wind. He looked like a demon summoned from the heart of the tempest. Collins. His voice boomed over the wind. You've made a grave error in judgment. He stepped inside, flanked by his remaining men. Jed was outnumbered, outgunned, trapped in his own home. He fired again, but the men scattered, taking cover. The fight had begun. It was a battle not just for land, but for survival, for redemption, and for a future that was being threatened by the violent ghosts of the past. The cabin became a maelstrom of noise and chaos. The relentless howl of the sandstorm outside was matched by the deafening roar of gunfire within. Splinters of wood exploded from the walls. The air grew thick with gun smoke, acrid and choking. Jed fired with grim precision, using the overturned table as his fortress. He knew every shadow, every creak in the floorboards of this cabin. It was his ground. He dropped another of Blackwood's men with a shot to the legs, the man screaming as he went down. But there were too many. 2 men advanced on him from the front, while the one from the kitchen scrambled to flank him. A bullet grazed Jed's shoulder, a line of fire that made him cry out in pain. He staggered back, his rifle clattering to the floor. Before he could recover, one of Blackwood's men was on him, a hulking brute with a wild beard and crazed eyes. The man's fist crashed into Jed's jaw, sending him reeling. They grappled, a desperate, brutal struggle. The man was stronger, his weight pinning Jed against the wall. His fingers closed around Jed's throat, squeezing the world starting to go dark at the edges. With a final desperate surge of strength, Jed slammed his head forward, connecting with the bridge of the man's nose. There was a sickening crunch of bone. The man howled, his grip loosening just enough for Jed to break free. Jed scrambled for his rifle, but Blackwood was there. He brought the butt of his own rifle down hard on Jed's back, driving him to his knees. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot through him. It's over, Collins, Blackwood said, his voice calm amidst the chaos. He pressed the cold barrel of his pistol against Jed's temple. I gave you a choice. You chose poorly. From the corner of his eye, Jed saw the bedroom door creak open. He had told Faye to stay hidden to protect the girls. A cold dread, worse than the fear for his own life, seized him. But it wasn't Faye who emerged. It was smoke. Thick, black smoke pouring from beneath the bedroom door. What is this? Blackwood snarled, his attention diverted for a fraction of a second. The distraction was all Jed needed. He surged upward, knocking Blackwood's gun arm aside. The pistol discharged the bullet, burying itself harmlessly in the ceiling. He drove his shoulder into Blackwood's chest, sending them both tumbling to the floor. At that moment, Faye appeared in the bedroom doorway, not with a pistol, but with a heavy, smoldering blanket from the hearth. She had set a pile of rags alight inside, creating a suffocating cloud of smoke to flush them out. It was a desperate, brilliant gamble. The cabin's on fire. One of Blackwood's men yelled, his voice tight with panic. The advantage had shifted. Blackwood's men, disoriented by the smoke and the fear of being trapped in a burning building, began to fall back. Blackwood, however, was consumed by a singular burning hatred. He ignored the smoke, his eyes locked on Jed. He drew a hunting knife from his belt, his face a mask of fury. This ends now, the way it should have ended 30 years ago. He lunged. Jed, still reeling, met his charge. The fight devolved into a savage, primal brawl. They crashed against furniture, their fists finding purchase grunts of pain, mixing with the roar of the storm and the crackle of the spreading fire. "My father was an innocent man," Blackwood roared, driving Jed back against the stone fireplace. "Your father, the great Judge Collins," he knew. He knew the cattle baron paid witnesses to lie, but he was too weak, too much of a coward to stand against him. He condemned my father to protect his own position. He pressed the knife against Jed's throat. "He stole my family's name, my family's land. He left me with nothing but a legacy of shame. Tonight, I take it all back. I'll burn this house to the ground with your father's memory and your new family inside it." Through the smoke, Jed saw Faye, her face a pale oval of terror, the pistol held in a shaking two-handed grip, trying to get a clear shot. He saw the flicker of fire licking at the bedroom doorframe where the twins were sleeping. Everything came into focus. His father's cryptic note. "A terrible mistake. May God forgive me." It wasn't just a mistake. It was a sin of cowardice. Blackwood's vengeance, born of a righteous grievance, had curdled into a monstrous obsession. "You're right." Jed rasped the knife, digging into his skin. He was wrong. My father, he was a coward. But his sin doesn't give you the right to become a monster. With a desperate roar, Jed grabbed Blackwood's wrist, twisting it with all his might. The knife clattered to the floor. He slammed his palm into Blackwood's chin, snapping his head back. He saw his chance. His fingers closed around the silver locket, still hanging around Blackwood's neck, his locket. He ripped it free, the chain snapping. Enraged, Blackwood threw him off, scrambling for the fallen knife. But as he lunged, a shot rang out. Not from Faye's pistol, from the doorway. Sheriff Gable stood there, his face grim, his pistol smoking. He had seen the smoke from town, had ridden out against the storm, fearing the worst. Blackwood froze, clutching his side where the bullet had hit him. He looked from the sheriff to Jed, his face a canvas of shock and thwarted hatred. With a final guttural cry of rage, he turned and staggered out into the blinding storm, disappearing into the swirling wall of sand like a phantom. The fight was over. The cabin was filled with smoke, the groans of wounded men, and the sudden overwhelming sound of a child crying from the bedroom. Jed scrambled to his feet, ignoring his own pain, and ran to the door, tearing it open to find Faye, holding Lily and Rose, shielding them from the smoke, all three of them safe. They were all safe. In the storm's aftermath, the world was washed clean. The rain that followed the sand had settled the dust, leaving the air smelling of wet earth and new beginnings. The fire in the cabin had been contained, leaving one wall scorched and blackened a scar to remember the night by. Sheriff Gable, his face etched with a newfound respect for the quiet rancher, took the wounded men into custody. Blackwood's body was found a mile from the ranch the next morning, claimed not by the law, but by the ferocity of the storm he had thought to use as his ally. The vendetta that had spanned a generation was finally over. Jed, with Faye by his side, traveled back to Haven. With the help of a contrite Sheriff Gable, who provided a sworn statement about Faye's ordeal, her name was officially cleared. The $53 were repaid, and the theft charges were dropped forever. Then came the most important part of the journey. In a small, sunlit office, a circuit judge listened to their story, looked at the two bright-eyed girls who clung to Jed and Faye, as if they had always belonged there, and stamped the adoption papers, Lily and Rose were now legally and irrevocably theirs. They returned to the ranch, not as a man and his mail-order bride, but as a family. The work of rebuilding began both literally and figuratively. Neighbors who had once scorned them now came with offerings of lumber and assistance, their prejudice replaced by a quiet admiration for the family that had stood against Silas Blackwood and won. One evening, as the setting sun painted the healing land in hues of gold and rose, Jed stood before the stone fireplace. The cabin was filled with the scent of fresh-cut wood and the sound of the twins' laughter as Faye told them a story. He held the silver locket in his palm. It was dented and scratched from the fight, but it was whole. He opened it, looking at the faces of Michael and Eleanor. For the first time, the sight did not bring a sharp stab of grief, but a gentle, bittersweet ache. They were a part of his past, a past he could now honor without being chained to it. He took a small, hand-carved wooden horse, one he had whittled for the girls, and placed it on the mantelpiece. Then next to it, he carefully set the locket, the old legacy and the new side by side. He was no longer just the son of a flawed judge or the brother of a ghost. He was a husband, a father. Faye came to stand beside him, her hand finding his. "It's over," she whispered. "It's all finally over." "No," Jed said, turning to her, his hand gently tracing the line of her jaw. "It's just beginning." A week later, the postwriter delivered a letter. It was addressed to Faye, forwarded from Three Forks. It was from a lawyer in the East, informing her that a collection of her late mother's jewelry, long thought lost, had been found in a bank vault. It had been sold at auction, and the proceeds, a small but significant fortune, were now hers, placed in trust for the care and future of her sister's children. It was a final gentle blessing, a promise of security that they had earned through their courage. That night, Jed, Faye, Lily, and Rose stood on the porch, looking out at the vast, star-dusted prairie. The land was quiet, breathing peacefully under the silver moon. The drought had broken, the ghosts had been laid to rest, and the cruel joke that had brought them together had blossomed into a love as fierce and resilient as the land itself. They were home.